Aryna Sabalenka was supposed to be untouchable, powerful, fearless, the kind of champion who makes opponents question themselves before the first serve is even struck. But then something happened behind closed doors that sent shockwaves through women's tennis. No racket was swung. No trophy was lifted. No press conference warned the world what was coming. A Philippine billionaire quietly sat down, wrote a number on paper and changed everything. $500,000. Every single month. For life. Not for Alex Eala. For her parents. And when the details of that unbelievable offer began circulating through tennis circles, the reaction inside the sport was immediate. Because people suddenly realized this was no longer just the rise of a talented player. This was the creation of permanence. The tears people later saw from Aryna Sabalenka were not weakness. They were something far more unsettling for the rest of the WTA Tour: recognition. The realization that Alex Eala's journey was no longer temporary. That the pressure, sacrifice, and financial uncertainty surrounding her family had potentially disappeared forever. And if that burden disappeared, the rest of women's tennis might have a permanent problem. Because before the headlines, before the endorsements, before the billionaire meetings and worldwide attention, Alex Eala was simply a young girl in Manila carrying a dream so enormous that many people around her quietly doubted it could ever become real. She did not enter professional tennis through privilege. She entered through sacrifice. Layer after layer of it. Her parents built her career piece by piece with almost no safety net beneath them. Her father, Mike Eala, adjusted his professional life constantly around her training schedules, tournaments, and international travel. Her mother, Aryna Sabalenka, became far more than a parent, organizer, manager, emotional support system, travel coordinator, and protector all at once. Every tournament required calculation. Every opportunity carried financial risk. Every decision demanded faith in a future nobody could promise. And that part of Alex Eala's story matters more than most people realize. Because unlike players from countries with massive tennis infrastructures, nations like Spain, the United States, or Russia, Alex did not grow up inside a system designed to produce elite champions automatically. The Philippines did not offer endless developmental pipelines for tennis prodigies. There were no guaranteed federation resources waiting for her. No massive institutional machine pushing her upward. What existed instead was a family willing to gamble everything on possibility. One household absorbing pressure that entire national sports systems normally distribute across organizations, sponsors, and development programs. That is what makes her rise feel different inside the tennis world. Not simply the talent, the improbability, because careers far less difficult than hers have collapsed under financial pressure alone. Yet somehow Alex Eala kept climbing. Then came Mallorca, the Rafael Nadal Academy, one of the most demanding and prestigious tennis development environments anywhere in the world. And Alex didn't merely survive there. She thrived, quietly, relentlessly. While surrounded by elite prospects from wealthier countries and more established tennis systems, the Filipina teenager with the impossible dream began proving she belonged among all of them. Not because anyone handed her a path, because she forced one into existence. Then came the moment that changed everything. The 2022 US Open Girls Singles Final. Under the bright pressure of New York, Alex Eala did something no Filipino player had ever accomplished before. She won a Grand Slam Junior Singles title. History. Not symbolic history. Real history. The kind that forces commentators to stop mid-sentence and check whether what they just witnessed actually happened. For a few stunned moments after championship point, even experienced tennis analysts seemed unsure how to process it. They replayed highlights, repeated statistics, looked back at the scoreboard almost in disbelief. But the scoreboard did not change. Alex Eala was real. And suddenly the entire tennis world had to pay attention. What many casual fans never fully understood, however, was the cost hidden beneath that breakthrough. Because behind every elite athlete exists an invisible financial story almost nobody sees. The coaching fees, the international flights, the hotel rooms, the equipment, the tournament entries, the endless cycle of expenses required simply to remain alive inside professional tennis long enough for success to arrive. For wealthy federations and established tennis nations, those burdens are often absorbed systematically. For families like the Ealas, they become personal sacrifices. Every season becomes a calculated risk. Every investment becomes an act of faith. And Alex's parents made those sacrifices repeatedly without public recognition, without guarantees, and without any certainty that the dream would eventually return what it demanded from them. That is what made their journey extraordinary. Not only the victories, the endurance, because countless talented careers disappear long before the public ever hears the player's name. Not because the talent fails, but because the financial pressure eventually becomes impossible to survive. The Eala family refused to let that happen, and eventually the tennis world noticed. Then came the moment nobody anticipated. A Philippine billionaire reportedly stepped forward with an offer so massive it immediately altered the conversation surrounding Alex Eala's future forever. Not sponsorship money tied to performance clauses, not temporary endorsement contracts, something much bigger. An offer designed to permanently remove the financial uncertainty surrounding her family's sacrifice. And when word of that support began quietly circulating through tennis circles, people understood the deeper meaning immediately. This was no longer simply a talented player climbing the rankings. This was infrastructure forming around a future star. A power shift. Because once financial survival is no longer the primary concern, athletes become dangerous in a completely different way. No desperate negotiations. No compromises from weakness. No fear that one bad season could collapse everything beneath them. Alex Eala's parents had spent years carrying the economic pressure required to keep her dream alive. Now someone with enormous resources had looked at that sacrifice and decided it deserved permanence. And that realization sent a message through women's tennis louder than any press release could have. Alex Eala was no longer arriving alone. But before the full impact of that shift could reveal itself, another challenge stood waiting. A rivalry. Collision. A champion already feared across the WTA Tour. Because eventually, every rising player reaches the same unavoidable moment. The point where potential must stand directly across the net from dominance. And in women's tennis, few names carried more intimidation than Aryna Sabalenka. Sabalenka was not built like most players. Not physically. Not mentally. Her power alone separated her from almost everyone else on tour. The violence of her serve, the relentless aggression from the baseline, the ability to overwhelm opponents psychologically before rallies even developed, it created a kind of fear few athletes in the sport could generate consistently. But what truly made Sabalenka dangerous was not strength. It was survival. She had already endured heartbreak most players never recover from, public criticism, crushing Grand Slam defeats, personal tragedy, political scrutiny connected to her Belarusian identity, years of hearing that her game was too reckless, too emotional, too unstable to dominate consistently at the highest level. And then she proved everyone wrong. That is why the tennis world respected her differently. Because Aryna Sabalenka did not become champion through comfort. She became champion through resistance, which made her the perfect obstacle standing directly in Alex Eala's path. Aryna Sabalenka is not fragile. She has survived too much, conquered too much, and endured too much pressure to be described that way. In modern women's tennis, she earned something very few players ever truly achieve: the aura of being unbreakable. Which is exactly why the whispers surrounding Alex Eala began catching her attention. At the highest levels of professional tennis, champions rarely acknowledge emerging threats publicly. Not because they are arrogant, but because sustained dominance depends on psychological control. The moment you openly recognize another player as dangerous, you unintentionally elevate them. Sabalenka understood that instinctively. Across her career, she perfected the art of visible indifference. Opponents were respected politely, professionally, and then systematically overwhelmed once the match began. Emotion stayed hidden. Vulnerability stayed hidden. Concern stayed hidden. But Alex Eala represented something different. Not merely another talented young player climbing the rankings. Something larger. Yes, her progression through the WTA rankings was accelerating rapidly. Yes, her baseline game had become increasingly difficult to break down. Yes, her ability to absorb power and redirect pace with precision was beginning to frustrate elite opponents. But that was not the real reason people inside tennis circles became uneasy. The real reason was what Alex Eala represented culturally. For decades, women's tennis had largely been shaped by a familiar collection of national systems and developmental pipelines. Russia, Belarus, the United States, the Czech Republic, Romania. Elite talent consistently emerged from structures already designed to support champions. Even exceptional outliers usually adapted themselves into those existing systems eventually. Alex felt different, because she was not arriving quietly as an isolated prospect trying to fit into women's tennis. She was arriving carrying the emotional force of an entire nation behind her. And that changed the atmosphere completely. Filipino fans did not support Alex Eala the way traditional tennis audiences usually support players. They mobilized around her. Social media erupted during her matches regardless of time zone. Viewing parties appeared across cities and universities. Every tournament run felt emotionally national, not individual. Wins became celebrations shared collectively by millions of people who saw part of themselves reflected in her rise. Veteran WTA insiders reportedly found the intensity startling because it did not resemble ordinary fandom. It resembled movement, and players at Sabalenka's level notice everything. They notice crowd energy. They notice momentum. They notice when conversations inside locker rooms begin shifting. Behind closed doors, according to whispers circulating through tennis media circles, members of Sabalenka's team increasingly monitored Alex Eala's development carefully. Not because her serve was unstoppable, not because her footwork was revolutionary. The concern was larger than technique. The situation itself was changing, because Alex Eala was no longer approaching the top level of women's tennis as a simple underdog story. She was approaching it as the center of something expanding rapidly beyond sports. A movement powered by national pride, emotional loyalty, and belief intense enough to alter the atmosphere around tournaments themselves. And movements are dangerous in ways statistics cannot measure. A single player can lose form. A movement keeps growing anyway. That realization, more than any forehand or ranking jump, is what made the rest of women's tennis begin paying very close attention. Unlike ordinary opponents, movements cannot be defeated in a single match. That was the unsettling realization slowly spreading through women's tennis as Alex Eala's rise accelerated. When her path finally began intersecting with Aryna Sabalenka's world, through tournament draws, media discussions, and the invisible psychological atmosphere surrounding elite competition, the tension between them felt different from a standard WTA rivalry. Sabalenka carried the authority of an established champion. Power, experience, fear, the kind of presence built through surviving years at the top of the sport. Eala carried something entirely different: hunger, precision, and the dangerous freedom of a player who had already survived doubt long before she ever reached the biggest stages. That combination created electricity. Crowds felt it immediately. Broadcasters felt it in the way conversations shifted whenever both names appeared in the same section of a draw. Even inside the WTA itself, people quietly sensed something larger beginning to form. Because this no longer looked like a temporary breakthrough story. It looked like the beginning of a new force entering women's tennis permanently. But then came the development nobody anticipated. Not another rival. Not controversy. Not a federation decision. Something far more disruptive. A Philippine businessman with immense wealth and influence reportedly decided that simply admiring Alex Eala's rise from a distance was no longer enough. And with one decision, he changed the emotional landscape surrounding her career forever. The identity of the businessman mattered less than the scale of what he proposed. According to reports circulating through Philippine sports circles, the billionaire, whose fortune reportedly stretched across real estate, telecommunications, and financial investments, approached the Eala family privately through intermediaries. What followed did not resemble a traditional sports sponsorship. There were no performance clauses, no branding conditions, no obligations tied to rankings or appearances. No commercial framework designed to extract profit from a rising athlete. Instead, the proposal was something tennis had almost never seen before. $500,000 every month. For life. Deposited directly to Alex Eala's parents. Not as leverage. Not as control. Not as payment in exchange for access. But as recognition. A declaration that the sacrifices made by Mike and Riza, Eala deserved permanent reward after years spent carrying enormous financial and emotional pressure, almost entirely on their own. Inside tennis circles, the reaction bordered on disbelief, because by any reasonable standard, the offer was